Hello everyone, my name is Glenn Holland Streamline Bricks and welcome to my first ever formal model review video. Today we'll be looking at my brand new model of the Buffalo Creek Gauley 280 steam locomotive number 13. Before we dive into the model, I'll give you a brief history of the Buffalo Creek Gauley. It was primarily a coal hauling railroad which connected with the Baltimore and Ohio at Dundon, West Virginia in Clay County. It ran all the way to the mine in Wyden, which was about 18 miles away, and had another interchange with the Elk River Coal and Lumber Company Railroad. The Buffalo Creek Gauley was originally chartered in 1904 and ended original operations in 1965. In the 1970s and 80s, the Majestic Mining Company reopened the line for a while, and in the 1990s, the Elk River Railroad Incorporated used a portion of the former Buffalo Creek Gauley track. Currently, much of the Buffalo Creek Gauley line is still there under a lot of overgrowth in the middle of West Virginia. But more recently, some tourist operations have started up again on the line with people offering speeder rides. The real number 13 was built originally for the Kelly's Creek and Northwestern Railroad as their number 6. It was delivered in January 1920 from the American Locomotive Company in Dunkirk, New York. The serial number was 61579. The driver diameter was 56 inches and it had a cylinder bore and stroke of 23 inches and 28 inches respectively. The boiler pressure was 185 psi and the tractive effort was 43,500 pounds. The engine weighed 99 tons, burned coal, and was classified as a G7S 280 locomotive. Life on the Kelly's Creek and Northwestern Railroad ended for 13 in 1954 when it was purchased by the Buffalo Creek Gauley and renumbered 13. In 1964, the Buffalo Creek Gauley retired number 13 and it was sold through multiple owners. And eventually in 1993, it was purchased by Jerry Jacobson for his Ohio Central Railroad pulling tourist trains. Finally, today, 13 resides at the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio in non-operational status. So a lot of you are probably wondering why I chose 13 to model specifically. Well, I had been growing up, I watched a lot of train videos on VHS and both DVD as well. And the Buffalo Creek Gauley was actually featured on one of those VHS tapes for a couple minutes. And while 13 wasn't on it, I eventually found 13 while researching the BC&G for other reasons. And I kind of fell in love with the locomotive because it was the most different of the 3 locomotives, actually all 280s, that the Buffalo Creek Gauley owned at that time. And it kind of spoke to me and I really liked the looks of it, so I decided that I would build it next. I haven't built a locomotive for my personal fleet since about 2.5 years ago. I believe the last one that I built was the streamlined K4, the second version specifically. Some people could count the Pennsylvania J1 that I've mentioned on a live stream before, but I don't count that because it's not a locomotive that I ended up keeping. My goal when picking a new steam locomotive to model was to build one that I could build from start to finish without too many issues. 13 was a good candidate because it was a simple 280 locomotive, and Kale and I had just finished building the Brickmania S160 at the time, so I decided to give 13 a legitimate effort, and here's what turned out. I started researching 13 seriously in January of 2019 and started putting bricks together on LDD on February 9th. I'm now recording this on June 9th, so the build process is almost exactly 5 months. One of my other goals with the locomotive was to build it in time for Brickworld 2019 so it could run on the first ever modular layout, and I've completed it now and it'll be handed off to Kale this Tuesday for him to take out to Chicago. Now I'll dive into some stats of my model. From running board to running board, the locomotive is exactly 55 studs long. It is unknown how the minimum curve this locomotive can handle. There's more detail on it than the S160, so it's probably not going to quite do what the S160 can, but that's alright. I don't often use those type curves anymore, but I do know that it can handle at least R88 at a minimum, and it could possibly do another couple of sizes down. I don't know how much it can pull exactly, but it would be almost identical to the S160 and possibly a little bit more since this locomotive weighs a little more and has, therefore, more weight on the drivers. Now under the hood, this locomotive is mechanically identical to the S160. They're both driven by one Lego L motor geared directly to the wheels, so that means that no speed is increased or taken away to add speed or torque from the drivers. The L motor is coupled to a standard power functions receiver, but the one difference between the electronics is that the S160 will take a regular LEGO rechargeable or AAA battery, and 13 has to use a custom 7.4 volt battery. Now the reason for this is I made that decision to use the custom battery out of necessity rather than desire, because I was building 13's tender and realized that I wouldn't be able to fit a LEGO rechargeable battery in it in any packaging at all. So I had to go with the custom battery, but the custom battery that I'm using, which I'm borrowing from Kale, has extremely similar statistics to the LEGO rechargeable battery, so the performance is about the same. Another difference between my Locomotive and the Briskmania S160 is that my Locomotive actually does include a Dali Electronics Highline Steam sound card. I built my Pennsylvania J1 and then took it apart several years later because it never worked right, and I had put a Dali Electronics sound system in that at the time. And since I took it apart, I had the system sitting around and just collecting dust and not doing anything. So a few days ago I decided to give it a little bit of effort and see if I could put it in the tender of 13, and wouldn't you know it, it fits perfectly and it works very well. Since it uses the LEGO interface, it means I can control all the sounds directly from the Power Functions remote, and I can customize it from the button on the sound card. Alright, now let's move in for a closer look at some of the details on my Locomotive. Here's a look at the pilot of the Locomotive, and the first thing that jumps out at you is the yellow decals that Kel made for me. They look really good and they're very accurate to 13. We used as many photos as we could find to make the decals, and Kel did a great job. We've also got the coupler cut bar here, another grab rail, the front suspension detail, and here is one of the 3 air tanks on the Locomotive. The BC&G had a lot of braking power coming down from the mine with loaded coal cars. They sure needed it. With the exception of the rods and the flex tube, all of the metallic silver colored parts you'll see on the Locomotive were done by hand using a Sharpie metallic silver paint pen. I did it all by hand over the course of an afternoon, and I think it turns out really well. Looking now at the front of the smoke box, I modeled the classic styled curved grab iron here with flex tube, and also the 3D printed number plate with the decal on top of that I think turned out really well. Then of course the headlight, the chimney, and then a builder's plate decal. Here's a look at the wheels and connecting rods. I used standard LEGO Emerald Knight drivers, which is equivalent to a Big Ben L wheel. It's scaled almost perfectly to the diameter of the real Locomotive wheels. And all the rods I designed myself and 3D printed using Shapeways. I think they turned out great. In modeling the rods, I wanted to get a much more accurate look to the Locomotive, so I modeled a lot of the extra detail you see on there, like several nuts and bolts and a lot of the smaller details that you wouldn't normally see on a LEGO steam locomotive. And to finish them off, I used Tamiya TS100 semi-gloss bright gunmetal paint, and they turned out great. They really add a lot of good effect to the model and looks a lot better, in my opinion, than the standard light bluish gray look than you see on most steam locomotives. Here's a look at the fireman's side of the boiler. I started off with modeling a lot of the piping down here, and one of the air tanks of the locomotive is behind it, very well hidden. Here are 2 cross-compound air pumps, which is a really iconic feature of 13. And then some more piping down here beneath the running boards and cab in front of the firebox, and on top of the running boards as well. I used metallic silver flex tube to model the grab irons, and I think it looks really good. Here's a look at the other side of the boiler. Up here I kind of modeled the mechanical lubricator. I didn't connect it to the rods just because it would have been a nightmare. Here's the third and final air tank with the tested to 250 pounds decal on it. I also modeled the power reverse and all the piping beneath the cab and above the running boards as well. Here's a look at the cab on the engineer's side of the locomotive. You can immediately see the Buffalo Creek and Gauley diamond logo turned out very nicely. And of course all the detail underneath the cab that I just mentioned. Arched windows, and of course I put a crew inside. And one of the things that I think turned out the best on this locomotive is the green decal that represents the door on both the engineer's side and the fireman's side of the front of the cab. Here's a look inside the cab. You can see I modeled both crew figures, the engineer and the fireman, as well as several details, including 2 water glasses and several gauges, and I also modeled the throttle coming out of the center of the boiler. Here's a look along the top of the boiler. I modeled the dynamo in both domes, the bell, and an apparatus which I believe is an automatic bell ringer. I put the number 13 decal on the side of this dome, and then the safety valves and the whistle just ahead of the cab. On top of the cab, I modeled the roof vent, which can be opened or closed, like that. Here's a look at the side of the tender. It rides on 2 standard freight trucks using brick model railroad or ball bearings. I modeled the steps and grab irons on both ends of the tender. The Buffalo Creek and Gauley decal turned out really well, and I also modeled the sloping side cold boards on the top. One of the key details that I found out about 13 is that sometime during the service on the BC&G, the railroad shops extended the cold boards above the tender to allow for more coal to be added in. I've always seen photos of 13 with the coal load piled high above the cold boards, so that's what I modeled here. Here's a look at the other side of the tender, and one of the things that jumps out at you right away is the addition of these red parts down here, and you're probably wondering what those are. Well, the BC&G, as far as I know, had a tow cable mounted on this side of 13's tender, which included red apparatuses and a hook on this end. And I thought that was a really interesting detail, and I had to include it on my model, so I did. The back of the tender looks pretty normal. I modeled the steps beneath the running boards, as well as the air hose, just like on the front. Another similar grab iron here, and the ladder going up the right side, and of course the rear reversing light and number 13 decal in the center. Now, I did paint a lot of parts on this model, and there was one part that I actually needed to paint completely, which is this part right here. It is listed on Bricklink as part 23950, and it's a 1x3 panel. They don't exist in the color black, so to make it black, I used Tamiya TS14 paint. The detail that I'm probably the most happy with on this model is the 3D printed connecting rods, which I designed myself and printed using the Shapeways online printing service. They turned out really well, and admittedly I was extremely worried that I had messed up a dimension during the design process, but it turns out they fit wonderfully out of the bag, and the paint just makes them really pop on the locomotive. I'm very happy with it. Now I'll turn the engine on and go over some of the sound features. So like I mentioned before, this model does use the Dali Electronics Highline Steam sound card, and it uses the Lego interface so I can control everything from a Power Functions remote. So I believe I have a Reading whistle selected for it, which sounds really good. And a Reading bell as well. That sound you're hearing now is the cross-compound air pumps. There's the bell. And overall, I'm really happy with it. I think it turned out good, and I was really pleased I was able to fit all of the electronics necessary into the tender. Now I'll get some clips of the engine running around the track on the floor of my apartment, but of course I'll need some appropriate Buffalo Creek and Gauley rolling stock to put behind it. Unfortunately, I don't have a nice fancy layout to run the engine on yet, so the floor will have to do. But let's go ahead and move it out. Alright, that about wraps up the video. Overall, I have to say I could not be happier with the outcome of this model. Having not built the Locomotive for myself in over 2.5 years now, and then now I have a new model that both looks good and runs really well, I'm just about over the moon with it. And I'd like to thank Cale Liepart for his support along the way and for his artwork with the decals. I'd also like to thank Andy Malman of OK Brickworks for printing the decals. And I'd also like to thank Mr. Brooks Stover and his excellent Buffalo Creek and Gauley website for the resources and information I obtained from it. Now, to answer a couple of questions I'm likely to get, no, I will not be making instructions for it, and I won't be selling a kit version either. This is a pretty special model to me. I've been, very excited to build it for several years now, and now finally having the time and the resources to do it, I'm very, very grateful to be able to model it in full. So I won't be producing instructions for it, I won't be selling it in any other way either. In the future, I would like to model several more copies of the Buffalo Creek and Gauley hopper. This is essentially a copy of the Pennsylvania GLA class hopper, which is a close cousin to the USRA 55-ton hopper. And you can see that there's a lot of similarities between my model and the USRA hopper that BMR sells. And I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and I'd also like to thank Cale Liepart for doing the decals for that as well. The BC&G also owned a former Baltimore and Ohio I-1 class caboose, which is another thing I'd like to model to accompany my engine. That's all for now. Thank you very much for watching and all your support. My name is Glenn Holland Streamline Bricks, and I will talk to you all later.